Hey class, my name is Craig Fries. This is week 9, and we're going to run through API 101. APIs are seriously neat, so I'm excited for you guys to see it. So API is an acronym that stands for Application Programming Interface. And move my face out of the way here, but it's important to break down each section of that. So an application is any software that has a specific purpose. Oftentimes, when we think of an app, we might think of the App Store, referring to Uber, games on our phone, the calendar app. But in this context, we're actually going to break down apps even further. So what is an app actually doing? So um, if you think of an app like Uber, it's a super complex application. It knows where you are. It can take payment. It can record reviews that come into the app. And so what it's doing is it has 3 separate applications built in. And what it does is it strings all those together. So the way that these applications are going to communicate is what we'd consider to be an API. So the interface of how they communicate. Um, so a parallel that helped me understand this further is taking and comparing and contrasting what a UI is versus an API. So a UI is something that we're super familiar with, right? It's the user interface, the buttons that we press on the screen, what we're interacting with. And that's the way that the user sends and receives information to and from an application. As programmers, we're going to be using application programming interfaces. And so it's the way that the programmer sends and receives information to and from an application. And so there's no fancy buttons that we get to press, no user interface in most situations, but it's how we're going to get information or post information to or from a server. So take a look at that. So an API connects apps together, and we'll take a look at a restaurant example. So we've all been to restaurants before, and I want you to consider the following apps that are inside of the restaurant. So that would be, obviously, you have a customer, and then you also have the kitchen. And so our friend, let's call him Jimmy over here, would love to be able to look at that menu and make a request to the kitchen. Maybe he wants some really fancy sushi. So he figures out what he wants to order. And then he's kind of stuck. He's sitting there at the table. He can't move from the table. And so unfortunately, he's never going to get his food. He doesn't have a way of getting that information or requesting information from the kitchen. So there's no way to connect. You can see the bridge. Unfortunately, we don't have a path yet. So although you might be able to create a convoluted way of connecting these two things together, an API creates a protocol of how we're going to be interacting between these two things. And so you might be tempted to think, I'll just make the jump. Obviously, that's not feasible. So instead, we're going to use a waiter, or what we'd consider to be the kitchen API. So it's a common naming scheme to name your API after the application that it's interfacing with. So it would be our kitchen API is the waiter, and they're going to come over, take our request, and bring that request to the kitchen. And then that kitchen is going to prepare their response, give that response to the kitchen. And if everything's okay, then it's going to come to us. So that waiter is looking to make sure that we got the right food. What we were hoping for is in fact what we actually need. So they send the request. The kitchen prepares the response. They send back the data or the food, the sushi, and then the waiter gives that response to us, or that food to us. So in the real world, we use words like client and server, but it's exactly the same. Imagine this is Jimmy ordering his sushi. The kitchen is going to serve up the food, and then it's going to make its way back to us. So the new standard for most what they'd call REST APIs is JSON. And so JSON is a JavaScript data type for storing information, right? And so the client has several options if the API deems it to be able to get information, post information, delete, or put. And then the URL here, you can see that they have different examples: surveys, surveys 123, surveys 123, all these different things. These are called endpoints. So these are the different parts of the data, or different ways that we can interact with it. So you might think, in that restaurant example here, the kitchen works directly between customers and kitchen, but the kitchen can also do catering. And so this interaction relationship here may be one way that the customer reacts with the kitchen, but they could have a different endpoint coming in from a different direction. That would be the relationship of catering. And so that's what these different endpoints are showing. So there's a bunch of different ways to find APIs to use. For me, it's what I did is I looked up free APIs as a way to just get my feet in the water and be able to really understand and what's going on. And then some reliable locations that you can use is the Google API. Anything with Gmail, YouTube, Calendar, Google Docs, Excel, Slides. A lot of those processes can be automated because Google allows there to be a waiter, a little in between us and their servers. That way we can interact with it directly. And then Rapid API is kind of like the Amazon of APIs. And then even if you just type in API, you can find many more there. So we're going to take a look at a real example that I programmed. But first, I wanted to show you some of those websites available to you. So the first here would be Rapid API. It's kind of like that Amazon. You can read through and lots of different options there. And then here is Google Cloud. This is, you have to make an account, obviously, to be able to interact with all of their app services. You can even pull descriptions off of YouTube, anything like that. And then API List is another popular one. And most of these are free. So what I decided to use is Quotable.io. And you can, what we're using is the get random quote. And this is the simplest way of understanding. So we use a fetch request and we're doing it on a URL. And so with every API, there's different ways that you need to interact with it. Sometimes they require different information. So when we think about a user interface, how I was comparing it with that, a lot of times to sign into a website, you might need or to sign into an application, you need like a username and password. Well, oftentimes these APIs will request you to authenticate and you put that information into a header. But what we're going to look at is just enough to get someone started on APIs and so that we can have an enjoyable first experience. So they use async and await functions, meaning that these aren't going to happen instantaneously, and it's actually going to send out that request. So we're going to wait for Fetch to come back with a promise, and a promise is establishing that connection, saying, were we able to make the connection, and if so, did we get the correct information that we're wanting? And then we await that response. So most responses come in as strings, and so we have to JSONify it, take it from a string to a JSON format. And then from there, we can interact with it with just as we would any other JSON data. So quote.content is a key inside of quote. So we'll take a look at all of that. The other things that I want to re-emphasize is what endpoints are. So you can see one endpoints. I made the comparison that you can be a customer ordering food, or you could do catering services to the kitchen. And both of those are different ways of interacting with the kitchen, with the application. So some different ways that we're able to interact with this application is through the URL here. It's HTTPS and then /random, where it just serves up any random quote. And then it gives you what the different parameters are of what we could request there. And then the responses. So 200, great, we made it. 404 is not found. And then 500 is an internal server error. So if we get 404 or 500 back from the API, we know that something went wrong. And if it's 404, maybe that's something that we weren't requesting, they couldn't get. But if we get back an error message, it means that we're communicating we just didn't communicate correctly and we didn't use what they were expecting. So I'll go into more of that here in a second. We can also list quotes with this API. So the key to having a successful experience using APIs is to read the documentation. Every API is a little bit different, and that's normal. And it takes a second to refamiliarize yourself with what's needed. So here I created a basic random quote generator. You can see we have the quote here, the author, the number of characters, and then the total number of characters generated from that quote. So I made it so that way, as you generate new quotes, you can see it totals up all of it. That's just to show that it's just normal data that we'd be getting as if it was JSON. Once we store it into a variable, we can interact with it like we would anything else. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this so that way we can look at the responses and the data up front. So this response, I want to take note of it. We're going to come back to it, and also the data come back to it. But notice how the data here, the author Winston Churchill, matches up with what we're seeing on the screen there. So we're going to first take a look at the responses. So inside this red section, where these bright caution comments are, highly recommend this extension, Better Comments on VS Code, by the way. We're going to take a look. So we have a URL, and you can already recognize it's the HTTPS because we're going to do a fetch request, and we're doing it on what they need. So this one doesn't require any authentication. We just type in /random. And so what I'm going to show here is if we copy this and we actually post or paste this link into the browser, we actually get the information from the server. So you'll notice it's exactly that quote that we're seeing here in the data. That is what we get here in that same format. So what we're doing is we're interacting with it, and we're saying, go fetch the information from this URL, and then the server, the kitchen, prepares all the information for us and then gives it to us. So if that response is okay, meaning we're able to establish a connection, then we're going to JSONify that data, and then we're going to interact with the data. And then all this is just adding the buttons, and this isn't in the scope of this video here, but I render the quotes on screen, be able to store the quotes, and then cycle through them. So this response.ok is just one example of many things that we can do with the response. So inside the response here, you can see right below the headers, it says OK equals true. And so if it's true, if we were able to make that connection, then we're good to go. Otherwise, we know something happened incorrectly. So this is 101 API. This is everything that you need to get to know in order to get started with them. Something that I would recommend doing is to continue to study about fetch and promises, because that's going to be the most common way that we as web developers will be accessing that data. So my question to you guys, and for everyone that watches this video, is in the discussion board, what would be a application that you would want to create, and how could you incorporate an API into that? If you want to create a weather app, is there a weather API that already exists? There is. They have Pokemon APIs, Star Wars APIs, and a lot of that data that you may be wanting to reference for your app likely already exists, and you can get it for free, or oftentimes at low cost. So I'd love to hear from you guys, and I hope you enjoyed this video on everything to get you started on APIs. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.